The old problem of good and evil. Are you a good person or a bad person? Well, today you can reflect on that while I'm going to tell you the story of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. As usual, I have lots of visual scenes prepared for you, so stay tuned for that and subscribe. But before we begin, a few words about the author. Robert Louis Stevenson was a Scottish writer who lived and created in the 19th century. He was born into a family of lighthouse designers, but he found his calling in writing stories, which he began creating before he could even read. Still, he was sent to the University of Edinburgh to study engineering, something that he was not really that excited about as he quickly started avoiding the lectures. And so, really to no one's surprise, after a couple of years, Stevenson began rebelling, not just against engineering, but also against religion. He rejected Christianity, more specifically the Presbyterian church his family belonged to, and he even declared himself an atheist. But that didn't really last for long, as after some time he started warming up to religion again, eventually writing prayers and even teaching Sunday school lessons. And while the rebellion against religion was rather short-lived, the rebellion against engineering was definitely a success, which resulted in Stevenson becoming a professional writer. He wrote novels, essays, and poems ranging from adventure fiction and romance to realism. You may recognize him from Treasure Island, which he wrote just 11 years before his death, and also a dark novel which he wrote 3 years later, titled Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So now we finally begin the story, and we find ourselves on a quiet street of London where we see Mr. Utterson the lawyer and his friend Mr. Enfield. And now when it comes to Mr. Utterson, we actually get a pretty detailed description of him, as this is going to be our main character. And so Mr. Utterson is a cold man that rarely speaks, but for some reason, somehow people still like him and find him lovable. And that's mostly because he has this warm human look in his eyes, something that doesn't really reflect itself in his words, but rather in his actions. On top of that, he's always eager to help and not to criticize, saying often, "I incline to Cain's heresy." Now when it comes to his friends, there are only a few of them, but they are all deeply bonded, either through blood or time. One of those friends is of course Mr. Enfield, whose relationship with Mr. Utterson is described in the following way. It was a nut to crack for many, what these two could see in each other, or what subject they could find in common. It was reported by those who encountered them in their Sunday walks that they said nothing, looked singularly dull, and would hail with obvious relief the appearance of a friend. For all that, the two men put the greatest store by these exertions, counted them the chief jewel of each week, and not only set aside occasions of pleasure, but even resisted the calls of business, that they might enjoy them interrupted. And so they are enjoying their walk together when suddenly they find themselves in front of a sinister building with no windows and all the signs of negligence. And then Mr. Enfield points to the building with his cane and says that it reminds him of a very old story. So Utterson then asks him about it, and Enfield recalls that one time as he was going back home during a dark winter morning, he witnessed a rather frightening situation. In the middle of an empty street, he suddenly saw two figures, one of a short man and the other one of a little girl. The two ran into each other, and then the man trampled over the girl's body, leaving her screaming on the ground. And so Mr. Enfield then ran after the man and he brought him back to the girl, but he noticed that this whole time the man remained cold and did not resist at all, and instead he just gave Enfield a look so ugly that it frightened him to his core. Soon the girl's family gathered around the place, and they quickly became very angry with the man who caused this whole situation, and so they threatened him that they will make his name stink from one end of London to the other. other. But the man again remained sneeringly cool, and he offered to pay as much money as they want just to avoid a scene. The family agreed, and so this is when the man led the family to the doors of this sinister building mentioned before. He went in, and after some time he came back with some gold and a check. And at first everyone thought that the check has to be forged because it was signed with a name of a very respectable man around the city, but the check later turned out to be genuine. Now, as Mr. Utterson hears all of this, he gets rather surprised, and Enfield as well begins to wonder how is it that such an honest man would be involved with that monster of a man that trampled the little girl. They then talk a bit longer, and that's when we learn that Mr. Enfield has actually found the man's address and also his name, which turns out to be Mr. Hyde. And we also get a description of Hyde, which reads, "He is not easy to describe. There is something wrong with his appearance, something displeasing, something downright detestable. I never saw a man I so disliked, and yet I scarce know why. He must be deformed somewhere. He gives a strong feeling of deformity, although I couldn't specify the point. He's an extraordinary-looking man, and yet I really can name nothing out of the way. No, sir, I can make no hand of it. I can't describe him. And it's not want of memory, for I declare I can see him this moment." They then think a bit longer, and Mr. Utterson eventually says that he has actually figured out who the other man is, the one whose name was on the check, but then they both decide to just never mention this case ever again, and after that, they both leave. Following that, we see Mr. Utterson entering his house, and the man is really not in the best mood. Because around this time, he usually sits by the fireplace, reads a bit, and then happily goes to sleep. But this time, he actually goes to his study room, where he opens a safe and takes some documents from it. And the most important one from the pile is signed as Dr. Jekyll's will. And so Mr. Utterson then takes it to his desk and begins to study it. And in it he finds two decisions. The first one states that if Dr. Jekyll dies, then all of his possessions shall pass into the hands of his friend, Edward Hyde. And the second one states that if Dr. Jekyll disappears or is absent for more than 3 months, then Edward Hyde should step into his shoes without any further delay. Now, Mr. Utterson has been aware of this document for quite some time now, but he never really liked it, as Utterson is described as a lover of the sane and ordinary things, and this document is definitely too fancy for his liking. And now that he knows what kind of a man Hyde is, he's even more disgusted with Jekyll's will, and so he says to himself, I thought it was madness, and now I begin to fear it is disgrace. Then Mr. Utterson blows out a candle, puts on a coat, and leaves his house. And that's because he figured that there's only one person who might know something about this case, and it's his friend, Dr. Lenyon. So Utterson then makes his way into Lenyon's house, and he finds him in the dining room, sitting alone and enjoying his wine. They greet each other warmly, and they have a pretty light conversation, which quickly turns serious after Utterson says, I suppose, Lenyon, you and I must be the two oldest friends that Henry Jekyll has. And so they start to talk about Jekyll, and it quickly turns out that Lenyon actually doesn't really see him that much anymore, and that's because more than 10 years ago, Jekyll became too fancy for him, and he began to go wrong in his mind. But that conclusion mostly comes from some scientific disagreements that the doctors had. And so Utterson then asks whether Lenyon knows anything about a man going by the name Hyde, and the doctor says that he has no idea who the guy is. They then talk for a moment longer, but eventually Utterson leaves and comes back to his house. But he really can't stop thinking about everything he heard today, and so he just tosses in bed, haunted both by his own imagination and also by the desire to see Hyde, just so that the mystery of his appearance will no longer haunt him. And so from this point on, he's really not able to let go of this desire to see Hyde, and so he begins to often wait outside the doors of the building Hyde often visits, and then one time, as he's standing in his usual spot, he thinks to himself, If he be Mr. Hyde, I shall be Mr. Seek. Eventually, the waiting finally pays off, as one time he suddenly hears some odd steps approaching him. Utterson then draws back a bit, hides, and soon he sees the man approaching, and we get a description that reads, "He was small and very plainly dressed, and the look of him, even at that distance, went somehow strongly against the watcher's inclination. But he made straight for the door, crossing the roadway to save time, and as he came, he drew a key from his pocket like one approaching home." So we see the man, and as soon as he's ready to enter the house, suddenly Utterson comes out of hiding, he touches his shoulder and asks whether his name is Hyde. At first the man is a bit frightened, but then he quickly collects himself and he confirms that he in fact is Mr. Hyde and asks what does Utterson want from him. But he does all of that without looking up at Utterson. And to this, Utterson says that he's an old friend of Dr. Jekyll, and then he introduces himself and he asks Hyde whether he would let him in just because he would really love to see Jekyll. But Hyde just replies that Jekyll is not here, and then as he tries to enter the building, Utterson asks him whether he would show him his face. Hyde hesitates for a moment, but then eventually he looks up and he stares straight into Utterson's eyes, who then says that now he'll be able to recognize the man again, which might be useful in the future. Hyde then says that it's good that they've met, and then he gives Utterson the address to his actual house. Then eventually Hyde unlocks the doors and he finally goes into the building, while Utterson actually stays here for a while, but then he also leaves. But he's now in great distress as he doesn't really know what to think about this whole situation, and so then as he's walking and thinking, we get a more detailed description of Hyde, which reads, "Mr. Hyde was pale and dwarfish. He made an impression of deformity without any nameable malformation. He had a displeasing smile. He had borne himself to the lawyer with a sort of murderous mixture of timidity and boldness, and he spoke with a husky, whispering and somewhat broken voice. All these were points against him, but not all of these together could explain the hitherto unknown disgust, loathing and fear with which Mr. Utterson regarded him." After that, Utterson goes to Jekyll's house just to see if the doctor is even home, and yeah, he's not. But interestingly, his butler says that Hyde actually never dines here, as he's rarely seen in this part of the house anyway, as he's usually just visiting the laboratory. And then 2 weeks later, Dr. Jekyll hosts a dinner for several of his friends, and then after most of them leave, he's left alone with Utterson. And here we get a description that tells us Jekyll is a fine-looking man, full of kindness and sincere warm affection towards his friend. The men begin to talk, and Utterson brings up the topic of Jekyll's will, and obviously he's pretty distressed. And the doctor of course notices his discomfort, and so he says that he has never seen a man so distressed. That is unless we count that ignorant pedant Lanyon with whom Jekyll is still disappointed, even though he still considers him a good fellow. Utterson then says that he has never approved of Jekyll's will, and now he's even more concerned as he's been learning about a man named Hyde. And upon hearing this name, Jekyll grows pale and he says that he actually doesn't want to talk about this topic. And Utterson replies saying that what he heard is deeply disturbing, but to this Jekyll just continues saying that his situation is very complicated and strange. To which Utterson says that the doctor can trust him and tell him about everything so that maybe together they can do something about it. But Jekyll just thanks him and says that he can actually get rid of Hyde as soon as he wants to, so that's not really a problem. They then sit in silence for a while, and then as Utterson is getting ready to leave, Jekyll tells him that he has a great interest in Hyde and he really wishes for him to obtain all of his possessions in case he disappears. And the doctor also adds that Hyde had actually told him about meeting Utterson the other other day, and he's afraid that Hyde was a bit rude. To this, Utterson says that he's not really able to pretend that he will ever like Hyde, but Jekyll tells him that he's not asking for that, but only for justice and reassurance that his will be fulfilled. And Utterson promises that it will, and then he leaves. Following that, we move in time a bit, and it's now a year after the previous events, and the whole London has just been startled by a horrendous crime. And the story of the crime is told from the perspective of a maid who one day sat down by the window and began staring at the cloudless night sky when suddenly she saw two men on the street. One of them was coming from one direction, and he was an old and beautiful gentleman, while the other one coming from another direction was, you guessed it, a small man whom the maid immediately recognized as Mr. Hyde. The two gentlemen came closer to each other, and the beautiful one greeted the other one and began to talk, but Mr. Hyde did not answer with a single word. And after a moment, Mr. Hyde suddenly exploded with anger. He clapped the other man to the ground, then he began trampling him and hitting him with his cane to the point where you could hear the bones being shattered. And upon seeing all of this, the maid, of course, fainted. Then, after a couple of hours, she regained consciousness, she called the police, but Mr. Hyde was, of course, nowhere to be found, but what was found was an envelope with Mr. Utterson's address on it. And so, both the envelope and the story are, of course, taken to Mr. Utterson, who gets pretty shocked upon hearing all of this, and then he gets even more terrified after he recognizes that Hyde's cane looks exactly the same as the one Utterson gave Jekyll many years ago. And so then Utterson takes the officer to Hyde's house, as remember that Hyde gave him his address when they first met. And they're let in by a silvery-haired old woman with an evil face smoothed by hypocrisy, but with excellent manners. She tells them that Hyde is not here, but that's actually not really that strange of him, as sometimes he's not home even for months. And so they then demand to see all the rooms in the house, and they do, but there's really nothing to be seen except for elegant rooms furnished with luxury and good taste. The only thing that does catch their attention is the other half of the cane found right behind the door, and then also a pile of grey ashes, most likely from many papers being burned. Following that, we find ourselves back in Jekyll's house, but instead of going to his normal part of the house, we get into his laboratory. And here we see both Jekyll and Utterson. Now, this is actually the first time Utterson has the pleasure of being here, and he's not extremely excited, as he's rather creeped out by the whole atmosphere, and it certainly doesn't help that Jekyll looks deadly sick. And so Utterson immediately asks him whether he has heard about the news. The doctor replies that it was pretty hard not to hear about it, and then Utterson asks him whether he's hiding his friend, to which Jekyll says that he will never even look at Hyde ever again. And then he continues saying that he's done with Hyde for good, and that no one will hear about Hyde from this point on. Utterson is of course not extremely excited to hear this, but before he's able to say anything, Jekyll tells him that he actually needs his advice because he has received a letter and he doesn't really know what to do with it, so he would rather just give it to Utterson. And the letter turns out to be from Mr. Hyde, where he writes that Jekyll shouldn't worry about his safety as he has found a way to escape. After reading it, Utterson feels a bit relieved, as he now believes that he can trust the doctor, but not for long, because right after he leaves the laboratory, he speaks with Jekyll's servant, who tells him that he doesn't remember seeing anyone deliver a letter. On top of that, Utterson later meets with his clerk, whom he trusts more than anyone else in this world, and so he gives him Hyde's letter, and the clerk concludes that the handwriting looks exactly the same as the one of Dr. Jekyll. So Utterson then locks the letter in his safe, and with terror he realizes that Jekyll has forged for a murderer. Now, following that, we move a couple of months forward in time, and we learn that for a while, things are actually pretty good. Mr. Hyde has disappeared without a trace, while Dr. Jekyll has been actually feeling pretty well, definitely better than before. He's been spending most of his time in the open air, his face has brightened, and the doctor finally seems to be at peace. And he even started dining together with Utterson and Lenyon, just like in the old days when the three of them were an inseparable trio. But that doesn't really last for long, as soon Jekyll stops coming out and also letting people into his house. Utterson, of course, finds it to be rather strange, as for the last couple of months he's been seeing Jekyll almost daily, and so he makes his way into Lenyon's house. Here he's immediately shocked by the doctor's appearance, as it seems that just in the span of few days the doctor became more skinny, pale and old. And not only that, but Dr. Lenyon now seems to have this unsettling look in his eyes that seems to indicate some deep-seated terror of the mind. Utterson, of course, points out Lenyon's appearance, and to this the doctor explains that he has experienced a shock from which he will never recover, as his days are now counted. To this, Utterson says that it seems that Dr. Jekyll is also ill, but Lenyon tells him that he wishes to never see or hear about Jekyll ever again, as he regards him as dead. Utterson is of course quite shocked to hear this, and so he asks whether there's something he can do, but Lenyon tells him that nothing can be done at this point, and so after a while Utterson leaves his place and goes back to his own house. But he's not really able to stop thinking about all of this, and so eventually he writes a letter to Jekyll complaining about the doctor isolating himself and also ending his friendship with Lenyon. And to this, he actually gets an answer from Jekyll, which reads, "I do not blame our old friend, but I share his view that we must never meet. I mean from henceforth to lead a life of extreme seclusion. You must not be surprised, nor must you doubt my friendship, if my door is often shut even to you. You must suffer me to go my own dark way. I have brought on myself a punishment and a danger that I cannot name. If I am the chief of sinners, I am the chief of sufferers also. I could not think that this earth contained a place for sufferings and terrors so unmeaning. And you can do but one thing, Utterson, to lighten this destiny, and that is to respect my silence." And so Utterson doesn't really know what to make out of this, and it doesn't really help that from this point on, things just keep getting worse. And that's because just a week after all of those events, Dr. Lenyon actually dies, and he leaves Utterson a sealed envelope with a letter inside and instructions to only open it after Jekyll either dies or disappears. And now Utterson is of course extremely weirded out, because there's once again this mention of Jekyll's disappearance, just as in his will, which of course Utterson is not very fond of. And so at first Utterson is actually kind of tempted to open the letter right now, but then he decides to just put it in his safe and listen to the instructions. Now following that, we find ourselves on a street, and we see here Utterson taking his Sunday walk with Enfield. And so very quickly they find themselves in front of the same sinister building from the beginning of the story, and Enfield says here that at least this whole case is now closed, as they will never see Mr. Hyde again. Utterson replies that, well, at least he hopes so, and then he adds that he actually worries greatly about Jekyll, and so he would really want to see him. They then leave, and soon they find themselves under Jekyll's house, and they see the doctor sitting by the open window. They then exchange a couple of sentences. Utterson tells Jekyll that he really sits in his house too much, and so he tries to convince him to join the Sunday walk, but Jekyll says that it's impossible. And then suddenly Jekyll's expression turns into one of pure terror and despair. He slams the window shut and disappears. Following that, we find ourselves in Mr. Utterson's house, and we see him here sitting sitting by the fireplace. But he's not alone for long, as suddenly Paul, who was Jekyll's butler, comes in and he's pretty distressed to the point where Utterson actually has to ease him down a bit. Then Paul eventually says that something has to be wrong with Jekyll, as the doctor has shut himself in his laboratory and he doesn't even sound like himself anymore. And so the two of them leave Utterson's house to see what's going on with Jekyll. They then travel through the empty, foggy street of London on a cold night of March, and eventually they find themselves in Jekyll's house. And here they are immediately met with all of the servants gathered up in fear, and as soon as they realize that it's Mr. Utterson, they begin to cry hysterically. Poole then says that he really wants Utterson to listen to the voice coming from the laboratory just so he can judge what exactly is going on there. So they both then leave, they make their way to the front of the laboratory, and Paul then asks through the doors whether they can enter, and Jekyll answers that he cannot see anyone. The guys then go back to the previous location, and Paul asks whether the voice coming from the laboratory sounded like Jekyll, and Utterson answers that yeah, not really, the voice sounded rather strange. And so Paul then panics a bit, as he says that they don't even know who's there in the laboratory, as it's definitely not Dr. Jekyll. Utterson then wonders for a while because he doesn't really know how to understand this whole situation, and Paul then also adds that Jekyll has been actually asking for some sort of medicine for the last couple of days, but every single time the servants bring him the medicine that he asks for, he says that it's not pure enough. And then it also turns out that Paul has actually seen Jekyll recently, but he doesn't really think that it was the doctor because Jekyll is tall and the man that he saw was short. And so they then talk for a moment longer, but then eventually they decide to break into the laboratory. So they both then leave, and as they make their way to the laboratory, Poole figures that the man he saw had to be Mr. Hyde, and so they both now conclude that Hyde had to kill Jekyll, and for some reason he decided to stay in the building. Eventually, Utterson yells through the doors that he demands to see Jekyll or else he will break in, and to this the man from the inside cries out to please have mercy, and immediately Utterson yells that this is not the voice of Jekyll but of Hyde. And so Poole now swings his axe upon the doors, the Shining style. The doors swing open and the men finally enter the laboratory. Here they see the body of a man laying on the floor and still twitching. And so they come closer to it and they recognize the face and body of Mr. Hyde, but the clothes of Dr. Jekyll. Utterson then realizes that the man is no longer alive, and then he quickly figures that what took his life was some sort of poison drunk from a vial that Hyde is still holding in his hand. So the men then begin to search for the body of Jekyll, but surprisingly they don't find it. Instead, they find a letter from Jekyll to Utterson in which the doctor wrote that once this letter is found, he has probably already disappeared. And he also advises Utterson to first read the letter that Lanyon gave him a while back, and then after that read all of the letters that Jekyll left for him, as then he will understand everything. And so after that, Utterson says that he has to read those papers in peace in his office, but he'll be back before midnight so that they can call for the police. And after that, they both leave. And now, following all of that, we find ourselves in Utterson's house, where Utterson sits down and he grabs the letter from Dr. Lanyon and also all the letters from Dr. Jekyll that were found next to the body of Mr. Hyde. And of course, as advised, he begins by reading the letter from Dr. Lanyon. In it, Lanyon writes that around the time when the three of them began spending time together, one day he has received a strange letter from Jekyll in which the doctor begged for his help. He asked Lanyon to go to his laboratory and get from it a drawer with some powders, a file, and a paper book, and then get all of that back to his house and wait for a man who will later show up to get the drawer. Now, upon reading the letter, Lennon concluded that Jekyll has to be insane, but he still decided to help his friend as the letter sounded pretty serious. And so he did what was asked, and then as he was waiting with the drawer, he decided to examine what's inside. He found some powders made by Jekyll, a file half full with a blood-red liquid, and then also a paper book with nothing but a series of dates with some one-worded remarks like failure or double. Eventually, the mysterious man showed up at Lennon's house, and the doctor was rather surprised by his appearance as the man was very short, but he had clothes that were comically big on him. And then the short man began to frantically ask for the drawer, and eventually Lennon gave it to him as the man looked like he was on the verge of hysteria. And the man then took the drawer and he sobbed with intense relief, and after that he began mixing the powder with the liquor. After that, the short man, whom Lennon actually recognizes as Mr. Hyde, drank the freshly made potion and to Lennon's terror suddenly transformed into Dr. Jekyll. Now, upon seeing this, Lennon was of course shocked, and he then became even more terrified after Jekyll explained everything to him. Although Lennon writes here that he doesn't have the strength to describe everything in his letter. And so after Utterson finishes reading Lennon's letter, he now grabs all of the papers found in Jekyll's laboratory, which turn out to be Henry Jekyll's full statement of the case. In it, Jekyll basically describes his whole life, and so he begins by writing that he was born into a large fortune, and then, thanks to his natural talents, he quickly found respect of the good and wise people in his circle. But despite that, he had a big problem, which was that he was very fond of the various pleasures of life, to the point where after a couple of years he developed a sort of a double life, one where he was a respectable man and the other one which filled him with shame. And so Jekyll then began to examine both himself and the world around, and he quickly realized that a man is not truly one, but truly two, one good and one evil. And not only that, but it seems that those two opposite powers are constantly struggling against each other, which makes life unbearable. And so Dr. Jekyll then decided to be a bit of a mad scientist as he began to study the body and the spirit of a human very intensely, and he eventually managed to create a drug that basically numbs down his good side and allows his evil side to manifest fully in his body. And at first he was actually a bit afraid to use it as he knew that he was risking death, but eventually the temptation overcame the fear, and finally, one night, he drank the potion. And at first, Jekyll actually felt amazing, as we even get a description that reads, "There was something strange in my sensations, something indescribably new, and, from its very novelty, incredibly sweet. I felt younger, lighter, happier in my body. Within, I was conscious of a heady recklessness, a current of disordered sensual images running like a mill race in my fancy. A solution of the bonds of obligation, an unknown but not an innocent freedom of the soul. I knew myself at the first breath of this new life to be more wicked, tenfold more wicked." And then Jekyll looked into a mirror, and for the first time he saw Mr. Hyde, the evil side of his nature, which was of course smaller and less developed, and that's because for many years of his life Jekyll was trying to develop his good side and suppress the other one. And then after that he drank the other potion, and soon after he transformed back into Dr. Jekyll. And from this point on, changing between his two sides became an addiction to him, and so he orchestrated everything so that people would become aware of his friend Mr. Hyde, which made it easier for him to transform whenever he pleased. And he felt great with his evil side, as it gave him this feeling of complete freedom, especially considering that Hyde could do anything and he would never suffer the consequences, as in some sort of way he did not exist. And at the same time, Jekyll also didn't have to feel remorse for anything, as after all, it was Hyde alone someone who was guilty. And so Jekyll now writes about all the bad things that he did as Hyde, including the incident with a child, but then he also reveals that after some time things started to get out of control. And that's because one time he went to bed as Jekyll, but he woke up as Hyde, and that incident marked the beginning of his body involuntarily changing between his evil and good side. And what was even worse, Jekyll now felt like he was slowly losing hold of his good and better side, and his evil one was slowly taking over. And so he knew that he had to choose between his two sides, and he of course chose Jekyll, even though he knew that from this point on he will be forever tormented by the desire to do everything that Hyde was able to do. And for 2 months he was actually doing pretty well as Jekyll, but eventually the temptations overcame him, and so one night he drank the potion again and transformed into Hyde. But this time the effect was even stronger, just as if suppressing Hyde made him worse. And so that then resulted in Hyde beating up the old man with a cane and fleeing the scene immediately, as he was of course not really stable. And now after this incident his whole life flashed before his eyes and his mind was flooded with the memories of what has happened, but then eventually he started to feel a sense of joy as he realized that after this incident he has to forget about Hyde for good and never change into him again. And yeah, he stayed in the form of Jekyll for quite some time. Those were the months when he started to go out again, but that didn't really last for long, because he began to be tempted by all the pleasures that were only available to Hyde, and he did not give in. But then one time, as he sat down on a bench in a park, he suddenly realized that he has turned into Hyde. And he panicked a bit because of course the police has been searching for him at this point, and he realized that the only way for him to turn back was to drink one of the potions from his laboratory. And so that's of course where we get the whole story of Dr. Lanyon and the drawer from. Then Jekyll came back to his home in his good form, but then very early in the morning he began to feel strange, and shortly after that he was back again, Mr. Hyde. And this time he actually had to drink a double dose of potion in order to go back to his normal form. But that didn't really help for long, as from this point on Jekyll no longer had any control and kept turning into Hyde every single day without a warning. And that's actually why one time he unexpectedly slammed the window shut when he was in the middle of a conversation with Utterson and Renfield. And then not long after that, Jekyll actually started to run out of the potion that allowed him to turn back into his normal side, and so because of that he kept sending his servants for the medicine, which to his terror did not want to work as well as before. And so Dr. Jekyll then ends his letter by writing that those are probably his last moments of having control over his body, which soon will be completely taken over by Mr. Hyde. And then Jekyll actually wonders whether Hyde will be caught and executed, or maybe he will end his own life before that, but then he concludes that it's not really for him to worry about, as he, Dr. Jekyll, considers himself dead as soon as Mr. Hyde takes over for the last time. And then he finally ends his letter by writing, "Here, then, as I lay down the pen and proceed to seal up my confession, I bring the life of that unhappy Henry Jekyll to an end." And with that, we end the story. It's good that we end it, because my voice is cracking so much. But I think that is good because it gave you kind of this emotional vibe at the end, so yeah. So that was the whole story of Jekyll and Hyde. Now, are you a Jekyll or are you a Hyde? No, but seriously, I think that this book really shows the danger of having this sort of black and white thinking when it comes to the good and bad sides about yourself. And this danger lies, I think, in this sort of need to separate those two sides and think that only one of them is true and the other one doesn't count. And I think it's dangerous because no matter what you decide on, no matter if the narrative in your mind tells you that you're a bad or a good person. It's always going to be false to some degree, because in reality you're both. So like, you know, I think that your bad moments don't necessarily make you like an evil person, and also like your good moments don't really make you a saint. It's more like your good and the bad moments just kind of make you a normal human. But now in case of Jekyll, I think that his biggest problem was that once he became aware of his bad side, he kind of didn't know what to do with it and how to deal with it. And so here in the novel we of course have this more magical approach where Jekyll can literally drink a potion and become another human. But you can also think about this in terms of people who kind of start living double lives, and so like the things that they do in the shadows, they would never actually do them or even admit to them in their normal lives. And I think that when you really get yourself deep into this double life, you kind of start to really separate yourself into two different humans on like a conscious level. So it's almost like when you present yourself to the world as your good side and you think about the things you do as your bad side, you actually kind of disgusted and ashamed, but then you go back into the shadows and you do those things again. And so I personally think that this sort of separation and also this black and white thinking is kind of dangerous for you, because like, first of all, if you separate yourself like this, then you're probably not going to really work on your bad side, and second of all, you're also not really going to have much control over yourself, I think. Because yeah, when you don't really perceive the bad side as yourself, then it's almost like you don't really feel any sort of responsibility over your bad side if you only associate with your good side, in a sense. Which you can kind of see it in the novel, because like in the beginning Jekyll was just a normal human, sometimes good, sometimes bad, but then as he started to really separate those two, then his bad side just deteriorated into pure evil. Another thing that I was recently thinking about, and I kind of want to like bring it to light because I've been seeing it, especially on the internet, I think. It's this weird thing where some people start to have this narrative in their mind that they're a good person, and then they meet someone whom they deem as bad, and suddenly they think that they can do all the bad stuff imaginable towards that person. Because in their mind it kind of like doesn't count. Like, you know, it's this thinking that, oh, I am such a good person and this is such a bad person, and so now my bad actions towards them are not bad. And so I kind of don't like it, because like, I don't know, I don't really see the logic behind it. I think that bad actions are always going to be bad. Like, you know, I think that in certain circumstances you can kind of like justify your bad action, but it's still going to be bad, you know, like just because you have some sort of justification for it doesn't really change the nature of the act, in a sense. And so like bad actions are always going to be bad, I think. Yeah. And like sometimes you can have some sort of justification for them, but sometimes you can literally see that like some people don't even really have that much justification. It's just like this thinking that I am good, they are bad, and so now everything that I do doesn't count, you know, like the bad actions that I do don't count because I am good and they are bad. And just to be clear, I'm not talking about any specific situations, because like this is more like an overall observation when it comes to humanity as a whole. So no specific situations, because like I don't know what's going on the internet right now, but there's always something going on the internet, and so I don't want to like, you know, give you the impression that this is like a commentary on something that I don't even know is going on. It's more like an observation of humanity, and I think that it applies to every single group. So I'm also not saying that, you know, like it really applies to every single group imaginable. It's just, as I said, I think that it's more like a human thing than anything else. So yeah, I hope that it makes sense, and I also hope that there's some truth to what I'm saying, but you know, as always, I'm just kind of like giving you my interpretation of both the book and the reality we live in, and yeah, so a grain of salt here. Other than that, this is the end of the video, so thank you so much for watching, especially that you're watching till the end. You can subscribe to the channel, and bye bye!